Hey everybody, welcome to the week 1 lecture on Reconstruction. And it's not ideal to be doing it over a recording, but that is what we're going to have to do here. Reconstruction is the period of in the South following the Civil War, when the Union or the United States tries to rebuild or reconstruct society after its destruction and the downfall of the Confederate States. We're going to look at this in a series of kind of questions to look at different aspects of Reconstruction. So we're going to start with, what visions of freedom did the former slaves and slaveholders pursue in the post-war South? The biggest outcome of the Civil War was the destruction of slavery, and because slavery ended as a part of the end of the war, freedom became the central question that our nation faced. Was freedom just the end of slavery? Did it mean equal rights for freed people in addition to the end of slavery? These questions became the center of Reconstruction conflict. Should we continue on with equal rights? Should we pursue voting rights? Property rights? To what level of freedom should freed people be given? There were contradictory interpretations of freedom between Southern whites and freed people and even Northern radical Republicans, keeping in mind that radical Republicans would have been probably the most liberal of the Northern groups dealing with Reconstruction. Radical Republicans would have wanted to give the most to freed people. They would have been on the train of equal rights, voting rights, property rights even. But that's very different from the meaning of freedom that Southern whites and sometimes even what freed people had in mind. Freed people's understanding of freedom was very much shaped by their experience as slaves and their observations of the white society around them. Primarily, they're concerned with escaping slavery and all of the regulations that are associated with it. So, almost immediately we're looking at being able to meet in large groups, being able to own dogs or firearms, be able to travel freely without any kind of pass or restriction on their behavior. Families, churches, schools all strengthened and expanded in the post-war South. You saw a lot of freed people try to locate their family members that had been sold away from them. Some even claimed pensions from Civil War fallen soldiers. You saw an increased level of power amongst Black men in the South, and women increasingly tried to stay at home when possible. After the Civil War, many women did not want to work in the fields any longer. Blacks created new churches that were completely separate from whites. They housed schools, social events, political gatherings, and you actually saw the role of Black ministers having a heightened role in society and even in politics. Over 250 Black ministers actually served in some form of political office, whether it was local or higher, during the Reconstruction period. There was amongst freed people also a really intense desire to obtain schooling in all aspects of society. You actually see the creation of the first Black colleges happening in this post-war period. Places like Fisk University in Tennessee, Howard University in Washington, D.C. But the desire to vote was really central to Black people's sense of empowerment and equality. Often, you saw African American groups in the South organized to obtain full citizenship and voting rights, would have demonstrations of patriotism on days like the 4th of July or January 1st. And their ideas of freedom were also tied to land ownership, that they felt like they had rights to the land based on unpaid labor. That they needed to be compensated, and being given tracts of land would have been that compensation. Some in the aftermath of the war actually seized property and took it, but often part of political organizing was dealing with the vote and citizenship. As you can imagine, in the aftermath of the Civil War, all Southerners are impacted by this, not just African Americans, although I think African Americans experienced the biggest shift. But, there's a destruction that happens in the South, right? And it's not just, physical destruction of war. It's loss of life. It's loss of a cause, right? Loss of a sense of what life means and what life looks like, what society in the South looks like. So really all Southerners are impacted. If we look just like at the basics, the destruction of the South really caused a slow economic revival. You have really low property values in the South. It's many planters lost their life savings because many people in that planter class had pledged a lot of money to the Confederate States government in the form of bonds. And when the Confederate state government crumbles in the aftermath of the Civil War, all of that money is gone. White Southerners often have a much different idea of freedom than Northerners do, than freed people do. It was a lot more narrow. And many, especially planters, really try to exercise the same control that they had in society as they did before the war. Republicans, though, in the North, so if we're talking about whites in the North, often they're driven by this idea of free labor. So they're not so different from the planter class in that, the idea of free labor doesn't necessarily mean that African Americans would need to have some kind of a separate job. Many Republicans in the North thought that, many freed people could do the same work, but now they would be doing it for wages. And so, they create the Freedmen's Bureau in part to enforce different types of labor contracts that would, and it would entail that a freed person would sign a contract with a planter to work the land and be paid whatever wage was agreed upon. But the Bureau was also established to deal with a number of social issues that were associated with freedom. The Freedmen's Bureau really is working in the South from 1865 to 1870. They opened schools, provided help and aid to people who were poor and aged, settled a number of disputes between whites and blacks, and tried to secure equal treatment before the law. But the Freedmen's Bureau was really underfunded and 100% understaffed. There were fewer than 1,000 agents in the South at its peak. So really spread very thin and unable to do the number of things that were needed to really make a large impact in the South. But they do have major achievements in education and in healthcare, but not really in economic relations. The Bureau was given power to provide 40-acre plots to former slaves. But President Johnson in 1865 actually ordered that all land needed to be returned to former owners. And so there's a series of confrontations that deal with that, because freed slaves were then pretty much forced to work on these white-owned plantations, and often for their former owner. And in these situations, they weren't really able to go anywhere, and so they weren't paid very well. Wages did remain pretty low. And so this failure of land reform, of being able to remove freed people from this land, or at least provide them with fair labor contracts, really produced a deep sense of betrayal amongst freed people. And you have new systems of labor that come about in the South as a result of this failure of land reform. You have areas where task labor remains the same, but sharecropping started to dominate the cotton belt and the tobacco plant. So basically how sharecropping worked was that a freed person would rent a portion of the plantation, and then the crop would be divided between the owner and the freed person at the end of the year. There's no day-to-day white supervision, but there's limited mobility due to low cotton prices. So they're really not making any money off of this land. You also see in small white farmers a loss of freedom, or what they sensed was a loss of freedom. Small white farmers, often in the South, were subsistence farmers, and in the aftermath of the war, really their land is devastated. And so you see a number of small farmers kind of forced away from subsistence farming and introduce something that's called the crop lien system, where basically these small farmers were forced to grow cotton, and they would have to pledge ahead of time part of their crop as collateral. And so if cotton prices fell, these small farmers would be left with a huge debt and the possibility of the loss of land. Not to mention that they're forced to continue to grow cotton in order to make their money back and to fulfill their pledges that they'd made. So now that we've looked at some of the competing definitions of freedom, we want to look at what were some of the sources, goals, and competed visions for Reconstruction. Reconstruction at its heart is a battle between different groups and people in the North. President Johnson and Congress continuously struggled over how best to reconstruct the South. And this struggle resulted in changes to the nature of citizenship and structures of constitutional authority, and ultimately the meanings of American freedom. Andrew Johnson as president. Andrew Johnson is such an unlikely president. He was Abraham Lincoln's vice presidential nominee when he ran for re-election in 1864. He becomes president after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. He is a Southern yeoman, which means he's a Southern small farmer. He has a deep sense of distrust of planters. He was also very intolerant and unable to compromise, which is part of the reason why you see so much struggle happening. He's also, because he's from the South and because he's a small farmer in the South, sometimes even considered more racist than somebody who might be in a planter class, because there's a lot more resentment towards African Americans from small farmers in the South. But May of 1865 begins a period known as presidential Reconstruction. So this is the period of time where Congress is not in charge. Congress had yet to reconvene. So Johnson himself was in charge of Reconstruction. Almost immediately what he did was he pardoned anyone who took an oath of allegiance. Not planters or leaders whose property was valued at greater than $20,000, but they did receive individual pardons from Johnson himself. Johnson also appointed governors to different states and directed state conventions to write new constitutions. He basically just gave Southern whites carte blanche, and which basically means he just gave them a blank slate. You guys can write whatever constitution you want. All it has to do is end slavery. And essentially what it did is it just recreated the pre-Civil War South. Instead of slavery being a part of the Constitution, you now have black codes, new state constitutions that include laws that regulate the lives of former slaves. It completely violates all of those free labor principles that Northern Republicans were trying to instill in the South. And Northerners really saw that Southerners were refusing to accept emancipation. Congress then assembles finally in December of 1865. At that point, Johnson to Congress announces that the Union was together, that there were functioning governments in the South, and that Reconstruction was over. But radical Republicans in Congress, who had the majority, were not pleased with the way that Johnson had granted such leniency to these Southern governments that had ultimately had traitorous actions. And so what radical Republicans wanted was they wanted these new state governments to be dissolved and new ones established where no former Confederates could be serving in office and that Black men were guaranteed the right to vote. Thaddeus Stevens, who was probably the most radical of the radical Republicans. He's also the Speaker of the House at this time. Went so far as to say that he wanted land confiscation and redistribution. The United States to take all of former Confederates' land and parcel it out and redistribute to former slaves. That was a bit too far, even for most radical Republicans. Too many upheld the sanctity of property rights to really believe that the United States could take land from one group and just give it to another. Republicans had the overwhelming majority in Congress following the war, but the party was divided. Most believed that Johnson's plan had to be amended, but many didn't think that it needed to go as far as Thaddeus Stevens wanted it to go. So what ultimately is passed is a civil rights bill that basically outlined rights and citizenship and anti-discrimination against African Americans in the South. Johnson vetoes this bill almost immediately, but Congress overrode it. It's actually the first major law in U.S. history where Congress was able to muster a 2/3 vote to override the veto. Congress then worked to create its own plan, which included passing the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to freed slaves. Johnson campaigned against congressional Reconstruction plans and other laws, really went out and made wild accusations. Because Johnson was so against it, many southern states refused to accept the 14th Amendment, and that pushed a lot more moderates into the radicals' corner, resulting in the Reconstruction Act, which actually divided the South into 5 different military districts and instituted new state governments that guaranteed Black voting rights. In March of 1867, Congress passed something that was known as the Tenure of Office Act. This was basically a test for Johnson. Tensions between Johnson and radical Republicans really were very heightened to the point where radical Republicans were somewhat trying to get Johnson out of office. So they passed the Tenure of Office Act, which basically meant that any cabinet members that had been appointed by Lincoln at the beginning of Lincoln's presidency, and because they had been approved by the Senate, that if Johnson were to fire or remove any of those cabinet members that Lincoln had appointed and been approved, then he would have to have the approval of the Senate to remove that person from office. That was what the Tenure of Office Act basically said. Johnson did not take kindly to the Tenure of Office Act and considered that to be an unconstitutional check on his powers as president. So he decided to test this new law and removed the Secretary of War from his position, a man by the name of Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton did nothing wrong, except that he didn't necessarily agree with Johnson's dealing with Reconstruction either. So Johnson violates the Tenure of Office Act, and the House almost immediately votes to impeach him, which means that he's brought up on charges for breaking this law, and then it went to the Senate for trial. There were worries about whether or not all of the radicals, Republicans, would vote to remove. And because Johnson and others that worked for Johnson and his administration understood that there were people that were on the fence, they were able to convince Johnson to promise to stop interfering with Reconstruction policy. And because he did that, The radical Republicans actually ended up 1 vote short of conviction. Because Johnson was up for election in 1868, the Republicans swiftly and quickly nominated Ulysses S. Grant for president instead of Johnson. So the 1868 election was basically a referendum on Reconstruction, and Grant won. It was a narrow victory, but that narrow victory led to the passage of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote for African American men. But as soon as you find a way to give African Americans in the South rights, whites in the South will find ways to remove them. This leads to literacy tests, property requirements, and poll taxes that were meant to suppress the black vote. These 3 amendments, the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, the 14th Amendment that granted citizenship, and the 15th Amendment that gave voting rights to African American men, really transformed aspects of the Constitution. Citizenship in the United States was no longer linked to race. It transformed the relationship between federal government and the states. States no longer were seen as the custodians of freedom, the ones that were able to dish it and take it away. The Constitution was no longer a document of state relations and property rights. Now the Constitution was used to claim a stake to freedom and seek protection from government misconduct. But it also displayed the boundaries of freedom, that there were racial boundaries of freedom that were redrawn but not eliminated, because Asians and Native Americans still were not guaranteed these freedoms. Women were also part of that boundary, right? Women that were in the women's rights movement looked to be included in these expanding freedoms. Many women had worked within the abolitionist movement and had lobbied for black suffrage. But it was also to advance the cause of women. And what they found was that they had again, what women heard was it wasn't their time. Because women were not given the right to vote within the 15th Amendment, it splits the women's rights movements. You actually have parts of the women's rights movement that are against the 15th Amendment, and then other parts of the women's rights movement that support the 15th Amendment because it was a step in the right direction of universal suffrage.